When the new owners of the old Renner House in Wexford, Pennsylvania, began renovating in 2019, their contractor noticed that the upstairs floor plan didn't add up, that there was a span of wall between two bedrooms, with no room behind it, where a room clearly should have been. He opened it. Behind a wall that had been framed, drywalled, and wallpapered over, sealing off a small room and its single window, was a space that had been closed up for 19 years. And in it, the remains of a man who had been declared a runaway in 2000. His name was Curtis Mayhew, and for 19 years the town of Wexford had believed he'd skipped out on his debts and his life. He had never left the house. He had been sealed inside one of its rooms the entire time. That is not a story about a man who ran from his troubles. That is a story about a murder hidden behind a wall, in a sealed room, in a lived-in house, for 19 years. A concealment so brazen it defied belief, and the renovation that finally opened it. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to a Pennsylvania town at the turn of the millennium, and to the man whose disappearance everyone found so easy to explain. Wexford in 2000 was a small town in the Pennsylvania hills, an old industrial place gone quiet, a few thousand people, rows of solid older houses from a more prosperous era, a main street holding on. It was the kind of town where money was tight, and a man with debts and a complicated life leaving abruptly was a story that surprised no one. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew Curtis Mayhew and his on-again, off-again troubles. Curtis Mayhew was 40, a man of uneven fortunes, a contractor and handyman who was good with his hands and bad with money, always a job going and a debt outstanding, a likable guy with a gift for getting into financial scrapes. He'd been through a divorce, had a string of creditors, and had recently moved in with his business partner and old friend Dale Renner into Renner's big old house, the two of them flipping houses together and, by all accounts, increasingly at odds over money. Curtis had a grown daughter, Steffi, in another state, whom he called now and then, and Curtis had one habit people knew him by. He carried a worn leather tool belt everywhere, his grandfather's, the leather dark and soft with use, a craftsman's prized possession he wore like a part of himself on every job. That tool belt would, 19 years later, help name him. In the autumn of 2000, Curtis Mayhew vanished from Wexford, and the town decided the man with the debts had finally run. Here is the story Wexford told itself, and how readily. When Curtis dropped out of sight, his business partner, Dale Renner, told people, and then the police, that Curtis had taken off, skipped town to escape his creditors and his messy life, the way Curtis was always half-threatening to do. It fit perfectly. A man drowning in debt, a complicated divorce behind him, a history of impulsive moves, and now gone. The police took a report, but a 40-year-old man with every reason to flee, and a partner who said he'd talked about doing exactly that was not a missing person anyone searched hard for. He was an adult. He'd left of his own accord. Case effectively closed. His creditors cursed him. The town shrugged, and Curtis Mayhew became one more man who'd run from his debts. His daughter Steffi, far away and used to her father's chaotic comings and goings, eventually accepted it too, though it never quite sat right that he stopped calling entirely. The detail that should have nagged was that total silence. That Curtis, who'd always stayed loosely in touch with Steffi, even at his lowest, never called her again. Not once, not ever. A man running from creditors still calls his daughter eventually. But the runaway story was so plausible for a man like Curtis that the permanent silence was chalked up to a guy who'd cut all ties to stay hidden, and no one looked further. And no one, of course, thought to wonder about a room in Dale Renner's house, because who imagines such a thing? The person who never fully accepted it was Steffi, the daughter, but she was young, far away, and had grown up with a father whose unpredictability had taught her not to expect consistency. So her unease had nowhere to go and no one to press. There was no dogged investigator and no relative on the scene. There was a plausible runaway story, a partner who'd supplied it, and a house with a secret built into its second floor. For 19 years, that was all. The institutional failure here was the runaway story's perfect fit to a troubled man. The way Curtis Mayhew's debts and chaos and history of threatening to leave became the ready-made explanation for his disappearance, requiring no search, no scene, no suspicion of the partner who lived in the house where he'd last been. It was easier to believe Curtis had run than to imagine murder, and far easier than to imagine the truth, that he was still in the house, behind a wall. His killer understood the man's reputation and used it, and the brazenness of the concealment. Hiding a body not in the woods or a river, but inside a sealed room of a house you go on living in, was so audacious that it lay outside what anyone could conceive. Then the case went cold, behind a wall, in a sealed room, in a house where life went on. Dale Renner continued living in the big old house. He'd sealed off the small room, telling anyone who asked, in the years after, some story about closing up an unused space, water damage, whatever served. Framed it over, drywalled it, papered it, and absorbed its footprint into the shape of the second floor so completely that the house simply seemed to have one fewer room than it once had. He lived there with the sealed room and what it held for years. Eventually, he too aged and sold the house and moved on, and the new owners had no idea the floor plan concealed anything at all. By 2010, 10 years had passed. Curtis Mayhew was long settled in Wexford's memory as the guy who skipped town on his debts. His daughter, Steffi, had made an uneasy peace with a father who'd vanished. Dale Renner was an aging man who'd sold the old house and moved to a quieter place. The sealed room sat behind its wall, holding its secret in a house full of new life. By 2018, the old Renner house had changed hands again, bought by a young family who loved its solid bones and old woodwork and planned to renovate, to open it up, to make it theirs. They had no notion of its history, no reason to think the second floor layout was anything but original. The secret of 19 years was about to meet a contractor with a tape measure and an eye for a floor plan that didn't add up. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Curtis. The case that had hidden for 19 years opened when a contractor noticed the math was wrong. In 2019, the family renovating the old Renner house had a contractor measuring the upstairs for a remodel, and he kept coming up against a discrepancy. The outside dimensions of the second floor didn't match the inside. There was a span between two bedrooms, several feet deep, with finished wall on both sides, and no door, no closet, no room where there plainly should have been space. He measured it twice, then cut into the wall. Behind it was a small sealed room, its window bricked or boarded from outside and papered over from in, its door framed away, closed off for nearly 2 decades, and inside the remains of a man, and with them the dark soft leather of a worn tool belt. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and it required no advanced technology to find. Only a renovation and a contractor who trusted his tape measure over the walls. A house had been hiding a body behind a sealed wall for 19 years in plain sight, lived in by family after family, its secret built into the floor plan. Forensic identification, supported by the tool belt, recognized by his daughter, and confirmed by DNA, established that the remains were Curtis Mayhew. He had not run from his debts. He had been sealed inside a room of the house where he'd last lived, the entire time the town believed he'd skipped town. Steffi Mayhew was in her 40s when the call came, telling her that her father had been found behind a wall in the old Renner house, that he had never left Wexford, never run from her, but had been sealed in that house for 19 years. The unease that had never quite settled in her was, terribly, vindicated. He hadn't stopped calling because he'd cut ties. He'd stopped because he was dead, and had been within weeks of when she'd last heard his voice. A body sealed in a room is a murder, and the concealment named the suspect almost by itself. It had to be someone with the run of that house in 2000. Someone with the building skills to frame and finish a wall and absorb a room into a floor plan. Someone who had lived there and controlled the space. That was Dale Renner, Curtis's business partner and friend. The man who'd lived in the house, who'd told everyone Curtis had run, and who happened to be a skilled builder, entirely capable of sealing a room so seamlessly that no one would ever notice. Investigators found that the partnership had been deep in financial conflict in 2000, that Curtis and Dale had been at bitter odds over money from their house-flipping deals, over debts and who owed whom, the kind of dispute that, the records suggested, had Curtis threatening to expose or sue Dale. Dale Renner was elderly now, living quietly elsewhere, his 19-year-old secret having traveled with the house he'd sold and stayed sealed behind its wall. He had not been hidden behind wealth or a badge. He had been hidden behind the runaway story he'd authored and the sheer unthinkability of what he'd actually done. Sealed a man in a room and gone on living in the house. Investigators built the case with the recovered remains, the construction of the sealed room, and the financial conflict between the partners. Forensic examination established homicide. The seamless concealment pointed squarely at the builder who'd controlled the house and confronted with the discovery. The body behind the wall, built 19 years before. Dale Renner gave way. He admitted that he and Curtis had fought viciously over money the partnership owed and the debts between them, that the fight had turned fatal there in the house, and that he had then done the thing that defied belief, framed and sealed off the small room with Curtis inside it, finished it over so the house seemed simply to have one less room, told the town his partner had skipped out on his debts and gone on living there, on the other side of that wall, for years. The runaway story he'd invented had held for 19 years because no one could conceive of the truth. When the truth came out, Wexford could scarcely believe it, and that disbelief was the heart of the story. The arrest of Dale Renner and the manner of the concealment defied what people thought possible. A man sealed inside a room of a house, hidden behind a wall, lived over and around for years, the killer going about his life on the other side of the drywall. The shock was not only the betrayal of a friend and partner, but the sheer audacity and coldness of it. The murder hidden not in some remote place, but inside the home itself, brazen and intimate and almost unimaginable. Dale Renner pleaded guilty in 2020 and was sentenced. Curtis Mayhew's status was corrected after 19 years from a man who'd run from his debts to a homicide victim. His name cleared of the skipping out that had defined his memory. He was recovered from the sealed room and laid to rest, and his daughter, Steffi, buried the father she'd been told had abandoned her, with his grandfather's worn leather tool belt, knowing at last that he had never left her at all. And a house that had held a secret behind its wall for 19 years gave it up, finally, to a tape measure and the truth. Curtis Mayhew was 40 years old. He was good with his hands and bad with money. A likable man with a gift for trouble. A father who called his daughter from the middle of his chaotic life. And a craftsman who wore his grandfather's tool belt like a part of himself. He did not run from his debts. He was killed by his partner and friend over the money between them, and sealed inside a room of the house where he'd lived, hidden behind a wall for 19 years, while the town believed he'd skipped town and his partner went on living on the other side of the drywall. There was no detective who cracked this one, and no relative who forced it open. There was a contractor whose tape measure didn't lie, a floor plan that didn't add up, and a wall that finally came down. It makes you wonder, how many disappearances were closed as runaways? Men who skipped out, people who ran from their lives, because a troubled reputation made running the easy story? How many secrets are sealed inside the walls and rooms and foundations of ordinary houses right now, lived over and around, waiting for a renovation to open them? And what does it say that the truth can be hidden in plain sight, behind a wall in a lived-in home for 19 years? Tell us in the comments. Do you think Curtis Mayhew would ever have been found if that contractor hadn't questioned the floor plan? What defied belief most for you? The sealed room, the killer living on the other side of the wall, the 19 years it held. And how many he ran from his debts cases do you believe were never anyone running at all? Justice came for Curtis Mayhew after 19 years, given up by a wall a renovation finally opened. Stories like his remind us that the easy runaway story can hide a murder, that a secret can be sealed inside an ordinary home and lived over for decades, and that being found named and cleared of a desertion you never committed is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.